John 8, 12 through 20. Verse 12 says, "Again Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." When we hear Jesus say, "I am the light of the world," we might ask first what we naturally would think of as the light of the world, quote unquote. The stars give light, the moon gives greater light yet, but the light that has best claim to being the light of the world is the sun. The sun is the primary light, the brightest light, the light that turns night into day. It is the best light we see from the earth and the best light by which we see on the earth. Is Jesus comparing himself then to the sun? Well, light and darkness are themes that recur throughout the Good News according to St. John. Light, whether from a lamp on the stand or a sun in the sky, is an antidote to the troubles that are caused by darkness. When it is night or when it is dark, it is difficult and sometimes impossible to see where we're going, for example. At night, it is easy to lose one's way, to get lost, to walk off a cliff or into a hole or a trap or an ambush. What we don't see can hurt us. I remember many years ago when I was in the land of Eretz Yisrael, and we were touring an area, staying in a hostel by the Ramon crater. And the night was dark, getting dark when we arrived, and it was completely dark by the time we finished our dinner. And we went out, though. We were curious to walk along the edge of the Ramon crater. It's something like the Israeli Grand Canyon. And we walked along the edge, and we walked down into the crater a bit, and there were some trails there, pretty well-worn trails. Reminded me of a deer trail in upstate New York or in northern Pennsylvania. And all at once there was a rumbling, and we got as close as we could to the cliff, and a whole herd of ibex, I believe they were, kind of mountain goats, came thundering through. And we were happy to get out of their way. The next morning, we saw that crater in the light of day, and we realized what a precarious position we had been in, because if one of those ibex had bumped us just the wrong way, we might have fallen 1,000 feet or more to an almost certain, to a certain death. And so dark is dangerous because when it is dark, we can't see what's there. What we don't see can hurt us. Walking in the dark then is both uncertain and dangerous. We can hardly tell if we're on the right path, and we cannot tell whether our path runs through safety or danger. Jesus then says that he is the light of the world, and that is means that he is the antidote to darkness. He dispels the darkness and makes it possible to see what's really there, and, by the by, what isn't really there, because sometimes we're afraid of things that don't even exist. Well, as we continue on, we might notice that darkness may be compared to ignorance, light to knowledge, because darkness conceals, but light reveals, as we've already seen in the illustration given. Darkness keeps us from knowing, but light gives us knowledge. It gives knowledge, in fact, to anyone who's willing to open his or open her eyes. Life is a journey down a path that requires light. Now, in the old days, before GPS technology and even before the invention of the compass, sailors on the dark and stormy sea would wait for the sunrise to show them where east was. By the sun's first light, they could reorient themselves. That's, by the way, that's why the east is called the Orient. It's the place where the sun comes up. And it's the place that we use to understand where every other direction is. Once you know where east is, you know where north and south and west are. And so the sun is our Orient. Now, when we think about the journey that we are on. There are times in our spiritual lives, in our moral lives, where we cannot really see where we're going. And what feels right may not always be right. Uh, but like the sailors who by the sun's first light could reorient themselves, Jesus gives us the means of reorienting our lives. A lot is being said today about progressivism, and yet if we don't know which way is east or west or north or south on the moral compass, how can we know whether we're making progress in any direction, not to mention requiring knowledge to know whether the direction we're heading in actually leads us to a location that reflects progress or regress. If you don't know where you're going and you don't know what direction you're going, then all of this is in vain. Well, Jesus shows us the path. Jesus exposes the dangers along our spiritual journey and thus helps us on our spiritual pilgrimage to the city of God. Now, when we think about what Jesus said about being the light of the world, we might remember the light of Israel. In Exodus 13, verses 20 and 21, we read that the children of Israel set out from Sukkot and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud to guide their way by day, and a pillar of fire to guide them, to give them light by night, so that they could travel by day or night. And this is what Jesus presents himself to us to be. He is that which will give us light even in times of spiritual darkness, so that we may find our way to God's country, not to the promised land, not to Canaan land, but to God's country, the heavenly Jerusalem. And those who do not know Jesus, then the Bible describes as being lost. If you don't have the light, then you are lost indeed. When Jesus says, "I am the light of the world, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life," we remember also that this is not the first place the Gospel according to St. John has spoken about Jesus being light. We remember that in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 13, we learned that Jesus was the light. And if we look there, we will see how we are to follow that light. John begins his book of good news with these words: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." He, okay, now we know that the Word is a person. He, that Word, was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And so, again, John's word is a he, and that he is none other than Jesus, as we will understand when John continues by saying of Jesus, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." It seems these days that darkness is very deep indeed, and that it is enveloping and encompassing everything. But there is a light that shines in the darkness that is not comprehended, is not overcome, is not doused by the darkness. There was a man, says the Gospel of John, whose name was John, that is the Baptist. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. It's important to know that there is a light when you're in darkness. And John told the people, there is a light, and that light is about to begin to shine. Get ready to take advantage of it. And he continues then, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He's talking about the birth of Jesus, the advent of Jesus into the world. In the Genesis story, at the beginning of the world, we'll remember that God made light before he made the sun or the moon or the stars. Perhaps Moses tells us that arrangement so deliberately because the Egyptians, in whose nation Israel had been living for hundreds of years before Genesis was written down, worshiped the sun. And after all, if the sun gives light, shouldn't we worship the sun? But Genesis tells us that before there was a sun, God already had light available. And John here reminds us that before the world was made, Jesus was already there. He was already shining before there was any other light in the world, or indeed in the universe. The light of the world is Jesus. Now, John, in chapter 1 of his gospel, goes on to say this in verse 15. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Now, in the beginning of this talk, Jesus declared himself to be the light of the world. And in that context, he is addressing a group called the Pharisees. They are listening to his words. And the Pharisees were Jews, but they weren't just ordinary Jews. They were the strictest Jews at the time of Jesus. They would have been revered as the strictest observers of orthodoxy at the time of Jesus. Of course, Jesus was also an Orthodox Jew, as were all of his disciples. But the Pharisees were known to be the strictest of the Orthodox Jews. The Pharisees then were Jesus' own people who read the same Bible, claimed the same status as God's chosen people. But in chapter 8, we see the example of what chapter 1 told us in general terms about whether or not the light would be accepted or not. Chapter 1 says that the light came to his own people, but his own people did not receive him. And so when we read in John 8:13, we see that the Pharisees are those very people who refuse to see the light. Not all the Pharisees, but the bulk of them, the main authority structure of the Pharisees, most of the most important Pharisees, not all, rejected him. And what they rejected was his claim. They refused to believe what we now know to be true, that the light of the world is Jesus. Let's continue reading now. So the Pharisees said to him, "You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true." And so the Pharisees are using a kind of a practical application of the instructions God's law had given them, for example, about court cases. Someone who was accused of murder, if they were convicted, the penalty was death. However, no one could be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. There had to be at least 2 or 3 witnesses to ascertain whether the death penalty could be imposed. That might be something for us to think about in our day, where we have the two extremes of some people that are willing to impose the death penalty for almost anything with almost any evidence, however circumstantial. And on the other end are people who never want the death penalty to be imposed. Perhaps the biblical instruction would be instructive for us to only impose the death penalty where there is more than one eyewitness to what has happened. There had to be at least 2 witnesses, and so the Jewish custom became that any matter should be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. And we all know that there have been murders in history that were pinned to the wrong person. And so, but here the Pharisees are taking this principle beyond a murder case, a murder investigation, and they're applying it in a general way. And yet, while you could make an argument that it's always good to have witnesses no matter what you're trying to ascertain, the reality is that the Pharisees were not interested in what was actually true. They were just interested in finding an excuse to reject Jesus. And we do this, don't we? Sometimes someone tells us something and all the evidence points that way, and we find some technicality to prevent us from accepting it because no man likes to accept a truth which is at that moment inconvenient to his agenda. And so the Pharisees used the Bible's own words and the Jews' own tradition not to discover the truth, but in order to prevent the truth from being discovered. But Jesus won't let them off the hook so easily. He answered, "Even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going. But you do not know where I came from or where I am going." And so Jesus is saying to them, look, on the basis of my own personal experience, I know, you might say I know what progress is, because I know where I have come from, and I know where I am right now, and I know where I'm heading from here, but you don't know where I come from or where I'm going. And so Jesus really does know that he has come from God, and whether there are other witnesses or not, he knows that that's true. But in the arrangement of the Pharisees, he still needs a second witness for the trial that he's enduring here, quote unquote trial. But he has another witness. That witness, he says, is the Father who sent me. And we remember that the Heavenly Father is the God that the Jews of that time claimed to worship. And Jesus invokes their God as a witness. Listen, "You judge according to the flesh," Jesus said. "I judge no one, yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. In your law it is written that the testimony of two people is true. I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me." Now, we might ask, how was the Father bearing witness about Jesus? Well, we can get the answer, interestingly, from the lips of a Pharisee named Nicodemus, who we met in chapter 3 of John's Gospel. He was a ruler of the Jews and the teacher of Israel, so he was an expert in Jewish law. And forever, what else he was also an honest person, and it seems that he eventually became a disciple of Jesus. But listen to his words in John 3 when he first approaches Jesus to have a conversation with him. "Rabbi," he said, "we know that you are a teacher come from God, because nobody can do these miracles you do unless God is with him." Now, Nicodemus is precisely correct. God was bearing witness about Jesus, having come from him by empowering him to perform signs and wonders. And apart from the Father, Jesus could do nothing. Now think about that. Jesus was doing public miracles for which the Pharisees could not, and in fact did not even try to deny. There were so many witnesses to what he had said and done that denial was implausible. There were lame men who were walking, and lepers who were clean, and dead men who were alive. There were those who had seen Jesus turn water into wine, and those who had tasted the wine. And all the people who had seen one or more of these things happen were alive and well, and the Pharisees, as part of the Jewish populace, did not live in a bubble. They had experienced these same things that everyone else has experienced. And how could they explain it? See, living as we do in an age that is skeptical about anything miraculous, we naturally expect the Pharisees to set about debunking the Lord's healings. And there's only one case where they tried at first to debunk it. That was the case of the healing of the man born blind, a healing that had never been heard of ever in Jewish history. And so they did try to find out if that had really happened or not. And at the end of their investigation, they were stuck with the fact that it had happened. And so where we immediately think, well, here are these, who would believe that miracles are happening? Certainly the Pharisees can just show that this was a hoax, but they do not take that tack. They take a different tack. They have to accept the miraculous signs because there are so many witnesses, and the people who were blind are with them, and the people who used to be lame can walk beside them, and so you just couldn't deny any of these miracles. But what they do instead, they don't accept the miracles, but instead they keep hanging up on some detail that offends their spiritual sensibilities. And in so doing, they miss the forest for the trees. For example, when Jesus had healed someone on the Sabbath day, they didn't say, wow, God is with him. Otherwise, how could he do this miracle? I mean, that's what Nicodemus said in chapter 3. But the bulk of the Pharisees weren't thinking that way. Instead, they asked why he was healing on the Sabbath day. Don't you have 6 days to do all your healings? And so they're asking him questions like that, as if miraculous signs were just something that any old person could perform any old time. Hey, Jesus, if you want to do some healings, just do them on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, but not on the Sabbath day. Wait a minute. The point is that he's healing people. And if he is healing anyone, it's got to be done by God's power, because God, in the Jewish understanding, God is the source of healing power. And so where else would he be getting the power to heal people? I mean, we know that Satan comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy, but God comes to give life, and that more abundantly. And so if there's healing power being exerted here, certainly it must have come from God. And so you see, if God empowered these healings, but they're criticizing Jesus, they're actually accusing God of a misdeed. I mean, here's Jesus. He's doing what God tells him. God says heal, he heals, and they say, why are you healing on the Sabbath day? Well, God told me to. And if God told him to, then their beef is not with Jesus, but with God himself. Miracles well, if God is not bearing witness to Jesus' origin in heaven, if God is not bearing witnesses to his divine mandate, his unique relationship with heaven, isn't he doing this every time he performs a miracle? You see, miracles in the scriptures are always signs, but the Pharisees are missing the signals. They're getting the green light, but they're stopping anyway. And, well, we see in all of this that God has stamped Jesus bona fide. He is bona fide, and they have missed it. They said to him, therefore, where is your Father? You say your Father is your witness. Where's your Father? And they may very well here be hinting at the fact that Jesus' birth had a little bit of an interesting story to it. People were a little bit uncertain. Some people said that the carpenter was his father, but if you really looked into that carefully, you found that Joseph did not claim to be his biological father. And then who was his father? And so they're hinting at Jesus's strange birth, perhaps. And Jesus answered, you know neither me nor my Father. Jesus is talking about God himself. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. Now, these are serious words indeed. Jesus is saying to the most religious people in Israel, you do not know the God that you claim to worship. You don't know him. By failing to recognize the hand of their God in the signs Christ performed, they showed how little acquainted with God they were. They insist that Jesus needs a corroborating witness, while the witness has been testifying right along. Every miracle was a corroboration that Jesus had come from God. And that being the case, their argument was being made less against Jesus than against the one sending and empowering him. And these words, John continues, Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. Now, these last words are encouraging to me. Only at the time that God had selected would Jesus go to the cross. The Pharisees were the most powerful religious group. Maybe the Sadducees were also, but they were one of the most powerful groups spiritually and politically in Israel. But his death was not up to them. It was up to God. And this is true for us as well, that our times are in God's hands. Knowing that, let us live in reverence for God and fear no earthly or spiritual being either. No one may harm us unless God allows it. And when God allows it, it is to fulfill his greater purpose. Amen. So let it be. All glory to his name. Well, I hope that this has been helpful to you today. And I wanted to get that message out there. It's been a while since I've put one of these out for public consumption, although we do have these lessons every week for our members. And if you'd like to be part of our live broadcast through Zoom or on Facebook at times, please send me an email at James Allen, A-L-A-N, Long, at gmail.com, and I'll try to include you in our regular broadcasts.